there, welcome to Stencil Girl. I'm Ray Missigman and I wanted to share a tip with you today about preparing your fabric if you're going to be stitching with the new vintage floral sampler stencils. It's basically the same as preparing your paper for a mixed media project or stenciling on paper, but I do have a few tips to share that will help make it a more seamless transition from your palette to the fabric. Before I do that, I just wanted to show you how the stitches look over the paint. And you can see from the back that the paint has gone through the cotton muslin, but that's okay. I'm getting good coverage on both sides with the stitches. And these pieces will either be framed or turned into a journal cover or something, so I'm okay with that. Now you could paint through your fabric with the individual colors that you would be stitching. I chose to use a neutral tone so that everything could be done at one time. And I knew that I would like that peekaboo look of the paint peeking out around the edges. And I kind of like that shadow color. So, and I'll share the color I used here with you today as well. Now, certainly if you were to match your paint colors to your thread colors, that would be a good guide for you too. I choose to plan out my colors on paper. I make little groups of colors of threads for what flowers I'm doing, and I'm hoping to have a course out on that sometime later this year or next year. But there's different ways that you can have your palette at the ready without taking the time to stamp each flower in those colors. Now, if you're going to use it as a mixed media piece and you want it to be hybrid with some paint and some thread, that might be a nice idea to go ahead and choose your colors before you paint and have everything prepped out with the proper colors. That way, if I wanted to stitch some and leave some with paint, maybe this rose was already in all the shades of pink that I wanted it, and I could skip over that one and come over here and stitch again. It's a really cool look, and when I have one of those pieces shared or ready to share, I will get that out there for you to see. So let's talk a little bit about painting on the fabric. Now, painting on the fabric is very similar to painting on the paper, except that A, it's very absorbent, and B, the fabric will tend to wrinkle or shift. I had ironed my fabric before I started just to make it easy and the lines crisp, but it's been folded in my sewing basket for a bit, so there are some lines in it again. You could do this without ironing it first, and I have a tip for that as well. But let's talk about the paint first. Now, I do use acrylic paint on the fabric. I always have a little palette ready, and I like to use an artist sponge or a makeup sponge or something like that to put the paint through. You can use something bigger. The big egg-shaped makeup ones work really nicely too because they have a little point on them. I like these because I can continue to cut them down as I use them. So as the paint gets more absorbent and wicks up the sponge, I can trim it if it's getting too juicy. Because on the fabric, and here's an example, it didn't get too far away from me, but let me show you. You can see as the paint got a little bit more juicy, the lines started to get a little more blurred. So it's very crisp here and here, but I had quite a bit of paint here, and because the fabric is absorbent, it wicked that paint out and made that line thicker. Now, when I'm stitching, I don't mind that because that allows me some freedom to sort of paint with the stitches in a different way. And I follow the fabric very loosely when I'm stitching. So this is a guide. I do want it to turn out like the template, and I do want to create this floral sampler if I go to stitch it. But I give myself the freedom to know that if my marks run together here or this line is wider, I have the choice, just like when I'm painting or collaging or sketching, to kind of manipulate that line and make it what I need it to be in that moment. And again, this allows you the freedom to kind of put your own mark on it in places. So while you might follow the template in general, you can add your own marks and lines in between, which is really cool. Now, the paint that I'm using that I showed you on both this piece And on this piece, this color happens to be by Chroma, Josanja Artist Colors. It's a matte flow acrylic, so there's no shine on it. And this happens to be called Moss Green. It's a Series 1 paint. I just like it for the neutral color it is. It really doesn't look like the color that's in the tube on fabric or on paper. So that's another thing you can play with first. I recommend taking a paint color, especially if you're going to use one neutral color throughout the piece, and swatching it on paper first, or better yet, swatching it on a scrap of fabric to see what background color that's going to be. Let it dry. It changes and lightens as it dries on the fabric for sure. And that way you can decide if that's the color you want as your base background. I always tend to use a neutral green when I do florals on fabric, because then, like I said, any colors that pop through of the paint in any area looks like a natural shadow color on a leaf or a flower. You could use a watercolor shadow color like a lavender or something like that as well. I just always gravitate to the neutral greens. So that's the paint. Now let's talk about what happens if you don't want to iron your fabric. Okay, so what you see here is my gel plate, and I like to use this to help stabilize the fabric when I'm printing on it. Now, I know we talked about wrinkles and things like that. You can iron your fabric. If you want a quick tip for not ironing it, you could spritz your fabric with spray starch and then just snap it out like you would a towel. You could use something like wrinkle releaser or some of the other products on the market as well. I like spray starch because it gives it a little bit of stability as well. And then once that fabric's dry, you can put it on your plate. I don't think it would hurt your plate at all to put the spray starch on your fabric and put it right on here, or even spray your plate with it as long as you clean it. However, if you do that, your fabric is going to wick up that moisture, and then you would still have to let it dry before you could paint over it. And by then, it probably wouldn't adhere to the plate anymore, like a wet medium. So I like to spray the fabric and snap it out just to get the wrinkles out. Then, when you're using a plate for your fabric, there's a couple things to consider. I own a really huge plate for making bigger pieces like this. Because if you want to do the suction method, you want your plate to be bigger than your fabric. But to share with you what you would do if you only have, say, a 9x12 plate to fit your 9x12 stencil, you would take your fabric and place it over the plate and then just carefully tuck the extra behind the plate so that that gel kind of grips your fabric. And it's a little harder to manipulate on camera, but you can get it nice and taut on both of the long edges. And you can just roll it back and kind of tug on that fabric a little to get any extra under. And then you could do the same things on the corners. So maybe just fold in the corner like you would a gift and then tuck it in just to kind of secure it. It doesn't have to be super tight, but you do want to get most of that fabric, extra fabric under the plate so that you're not dealing with a lot of excess there. And that will keep it secure enough that it's not moving and shifting when you're stenciling, because what we don't want for stitching is any shadow marks. So then I could place my stencil over the fabric and I would be good to go with stitching. Now, if you have a piece of fabric that is smaller than what you're printing, so for instance, today, I do a lot of small stitch. I do a lot of techniques where I only use a partial or a portion of a stencil and not the whole thing. So this would be an instance where I would put a random, like in the last video, piece of the stencil over the paper or fabric that I am stenciling. So if I were to use something like this, and this has been starched and kind of snapped out, so It has most of the big wrinkles and folds from the store out. I could tuck any extra if I wanted under, just like I did with my big piece. And then I would take the stencil, and depending on where I wanted to place it, I would place it over, and what I'm going to get is adhesion to the plate with the stencil where there is no fabric. So that kind of secures the smaller pieces to the plate when I don't have all that extra fabric to tuck to keep it from moving. And that really helps to kind of stabilize what I'm doing so I don't get those shadow effects. So let's stencil a little bit of this together. We're not going to stitch on camera together, but I will show you how I do add the paint through the stencil. So I put a little bit on my palette, and I have a clean sponge. And what I want to do is take some of that paint and move it around on the palette so that I get a smooth, even coverage on the bottom of my sponge. And then I'll still want to hold down my stencil in the areas where I'm applying the paint and just carefully pounce through the stencil using the paint. And you can see that if I press down on the stencil, it allows me to add the paint there without the worry of it popping up as I'm working. And I would just keep applying the paint through the stencil opening until I had all of the fabric stenciled. And then the nice part about this is because the fabric is in place and smaller than my plate, I can gently lift one edge of the stencil to see if I'm getting a clean read or if I want to reapply the paint anywhere before I pick the stencil up. Now, when it comes to stitching, I'm usually not as concerned about a missing line or two here and there because I have that freedom of filling in with stitches. But if I want to make sure that it's dark enough to see in areas, I could just lift and repair any areas I see that may need a few extra lines. And then I have my painted fabric. All right, and lastly, let's just try to paint or stencil onto the unironed fabric without the plate for those of us who don't want to do that before we stitch. So I just have my tablet of mixed media paper here. I'm just using it as a neutral background. I've kind of worked some of the wrinkles out. I'm not using the spray starch or anything. I'm just going to use a little tape in a few places to secure the fabric to the tablet. And this is just a washi tape of sorts, so it will remove from the fabric and paper easily. I usually reserve one piece or tablet of paper for all of these kinds of background experiments. This last side I could tuck under a little and tape, or I could just take a piece and pull it around. I'm not stenciling all the way to the edges, so I'm okay with that. And then I would take my stencil and place it over the fabric and add just a couple more pieces of tape, maybe on the edges, just to secure it so it doesn't shift either. And I can do a little on the short ends as well. I'm still going to have to hold my stencil down a little when I stencil, but that's okay. So I'm going to add some more paint to the plate. And once again, bring the paint out and get a smooth layer. Remember, we don't want too much paint because the fabric will really absorb that quickly. And I won't stencil all of this, but I will show you the difference in the impression on stenciling on a hard surface, like a tablet of paper, as opposed to on the surface of the gel plate, which has some give to it. But this works just as well. And oftentimes, even though this method has a few extra steps, you will get a cleaner read on the first impression. And let's do a little over here. If you see any areas that look like they don't have any paint at all, you can always come back and look through that, because like I said, this method isn't as user-friendly for picking it up and checking as the plate, because the plate will suction that stencil back down in the exact same position it was originally. But by looking at it, I can see most of my openings have paint through them. Again, when it comes to stitching, I'm okay if there's some areas where the lines are lighter or the impression is less than perfect, because when I'm stitching, that will give me that creative freedom. But it's definitely enough that I have a pattern to follow, like a sample pattern. So let's take a look at this one. So taking the tape and slowly peeling it back from the stencil, I can get a look at how it turned out, and that's nice. The wrinkles didn't get in the way of my impression. Where the paint was juicier, I didn't get any bleed because my fabric was nice and dry. In areas where the marks are much lighter, I still get a faint impression of the sampler, so I can easily follow that while I'm stitching, and I really like that. There are areas where it came up close to the edge. I know unless I'm holding that fabric in my hand and stitching, I won't get all of those, but this gives me some freedom to move my hoop around and decide where I want to stitch. So I like that. So just keep in mind, if you want to do the full 9x12 sampler, you'll need to make sure your fabric is larger than your stencil and large enough to fit into your hoop and move it around so you still have those edges. So I hope that helps you get an idea of how to start the fabric for your hoop, for any mixed media stitching you want to do. It's really fun, and you can take this to lots of levels in your mixed media, especially with these small pieces that once they're stitched, you can cut and snip and add into your journals. It's just so much fun. I hope you learned a little something about prepping your fabric for stitching, should you choose to do that in your mixed media projects. I can't wait to see what you do both on paper and fabric. Happy creating.